Shalom, dear friends. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Helen and Sam Steinberg Memorial Lecture of 2021. I offer a particular welcome to the members of the Steinberg family, the family's continued devotion to the Shar, including the leadership role in presenting this lectureship is a testament to the extraordinary legacy of Helen and Sam Steinberg. We have just emerged from the festival of Sukkot, which comes on the heels of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and whereas the very intense high holy days take place primarily in the synagogue, the worship is within the walls of the synagogue. Sukkot brings us outdoors, and symbolically, this is our religious mandate to take the inspiration of the synagogue and to bring it outward, to impact the larger community. And in so many ways, a lectureship such as the Steinberg Lecture, an event such as this one, it fulfills our community's objectives of speaking to issues that are relevant to the larger community and allowing our inspiration, the inspiration of the Shar, to reach well beyond the physical walls of our congregation. In a moment, I'll call upon Louis Dabra to introduce this evening's guests. It's an understatement to say that Louis is a leader of the highest caliber. His fingerprint, his hard work is on so much of what the Shar offers and what the Shar is, which is a center of high-level learning and discussions and opportunities to deepen our Jewish experiences and our Jewish identity. Thank you, Louis. Thank you to the entire Steinberg family. And thank you to everyone watching us and joining us for this very special program.
Good evening, Rabbi, ladies and gentlemen. I have to ask for some indulgence from the two Jonathans speaking this evening because I'm in a nostalgic frame of mind. Tonight's Steinberg Lecture feels different. For the first time, it is virtual. This has upset the precedent of our dinner prior to the lecture for family, friends, and Shar leadership. That ritual was the highlight for my lovely grandmother, Helen Steinberg. It was so important to her, in particular the bringing together of the enormous Steinberg family, that we continued the tradition after her passing in her 99th year in 2007. It is Helen who established the lectureship in honor of her husband Sam, who died in 1978. She approached Rabbi Shushat, who both my grandparents adored, for counsel on how best to honor her husband's memory. Rabbi Shushat suggested a lectureship, as he himself had done years later in memory of his own beloved daughter Elizabeth. When Helen's children became aware of the endowment, they insisted it be called the Helen and Sam Steinberg Lecture. The inaugural lecture took place in 1982. My mother, of blessed memory, the inimitable Mitzi, suggested Barbara Walters be the speaker. Rabbi Shushat gently countered that while he admired many of those interviewed by the celebrity Walters, one ought not give the podium to the chatty interviewer herself. Indeed, Rabbi Shushat set a very high bar for the lecture. It should address the great moral and global issues of the day and, where pertinent, their impact on Jews and Judaism. The inaugural lecture was delivered by Sir William Rees-Mogg, later named Lord, editor of the Times of London, who at the time had written a remarkable essay interpreting Judaism. He spoke of the implications of the financial crisis facing the world. If interested in past speakers of this storied lectureship, Google the Helen and Sam Steinberg Lecture, and you will see the luminaries that have spoken in the past. My personal involvement began in 1990 when I took over the running of the lectureship by inviting my beloved professor Alan Bloom, who had recently published The Closing of the American Mind, which sold over 1 million copies. Years later, I recall surprising our congregants when Cornel West was invited to deliver the Steinberg Lecture. An unusual choice, to be sure, but not because he was not Jewish. After all, prior speakers included Arthur Schlesinger Jr., William Styron, John Ralston Saul, and James Carroll. Cornel West was a risky choice because he was a strident critic of Israel. Nevertheless, he was chosen because he greatly admired and taught the Hebrew prophets. He deplored that Socrates never shed a tear. For him, the emotional resonance from Jerusalem was a welcome counterweight to the cold rationality of Athens. This I learned from my son Philip, who had taken 2 seminars with Cornel West and was enchanted with his professor. To be honest, The most exciting part of that evening was listening to my son introducing his professor. West asked my son for a copy of the introduction to give to his mother. To be sure, there have been speakers I have pursued with dogged persistence, but without success. These include Philip Roth, Robert Caro, and Bernard Lewis. I'm singling out these three because I invited each of them on 3 separate occasions to no avail. When Rabbi Pupko's shul brought in Bernard Lewis, I called my friend Jack Dim, wondering how he managed to lure the renowned Lewis to Montreal. Very simple. He sent a private plane to Princeton to pick him up. Francine Klagsbrunn, who spoke in our series of Tuesday Night Learning on her masterful biography of Golda Meir, explained to me that Robert Caro, a regular guest at her Seder, never accepts invitations from synagogues. Persistence does, however, sometimes yield results. It took 7 years to finally secure Lord Jonathan Sacks to deliver the Steinberg lecture, but it was well worth the wait. The genesis of this evening's lecture is unique. Typically, an invitation to the lecture has a long gestation, not this time. On July 1st, I read David Brooks' New York Times op-ed online entitled How to Destroy Truth. The version that appeared in print the next day was retitled How Truth Dies. Brooks wrote of the collapse of trust, the rise of animosity, and the extreme polarization in America. Faith in institutions has plummeted. Elites of all stripes, including scientists and physicians, are distrusted, and disinformation, lies, and alternate realities, both on the right and left, are ubiquitous. Brooks made reference to and spoke glowingly of Jonathan Rauch's book, The Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth, which he dubbed brilliant. I knew viscerally that moment that I wanted Jonathan Rauch to speak at the Shar on his new book. What could be more timely? Reinforcing my gut decision was my recollection that a hero of mine, Jonathan Haidt, had also highly recommended The Constitution of Knowledge. Haidt did groundbreaking research examining the intuitive foundations of morality and how morality varies across cultures. I loved, among his 9 bestseller books, The Righteous Mind and The Coddling of the American Mind. Jonathan Haidt is a social psychologist and professor of ethical leadership at NYU Stern School of Business, also someone I've invited numerous times to speak at Tuesday Night Learning, and once the Steinberg lecture, to no avail. He always refused graciously, explaining that the timing conflicted with other obligations, such as completing a book. Back to Jonathan Rauch. He is the rarest of species, a public intellectual. A graduate of Yale University, he's a senior fellow in the Governance Studies program at the Brookings Institute, and author of 8 books and many articles on public policy, culture, and government. His warm and calm disposition exudes intellectual fair-mindedness and integrity. The stars were definitely aligned on that day this past July when I contacted Jonathan Rauch to deliver the Helen and Sam Steinberg lecture, because 30 minutes later, I received a call from Rauch himself with an affirmative response. He made only one request. In lieu of a lecture, he preferred the format of a conversation with his friend Jonathan Haidt. Music to my ears. I could not believe my good fortune of securing Jonathan Rauch in conversation with Jonathan Haidt. This evening will conclude with a thank you by Kenny Mintzberg, the eldest great-grandchild of Helen and Sam Steinberg. I now turn to the 2 Jonathans to let the conversation begin.
Well, thank you so much, Lewis. What a lovely, lovely introduction. I'm a little resentful that you didn't send a plane for us, but I guess in times of COVID, this will have to do. But I am very grateful to be invited with my friend Jonathan Rauch, and now to learn about the illustrious history of this lecture series, to learn that we are following in the footsteps of our beloved Rabbi Sacks, one of the most brilliant and passionate voices on the sorts of issues that we're talking about today. What is going wrong with our modern liberal democratic societies, Britain included, Canada included. So it is very exciting and a great pleasure to be here talking to you. And to know that the point of this lecture series is to talk about the great crises affecting us in general, and then also their particular influence or effects on the Jewish community, something that Jonathan and I have both thought about and been writing about. For convenience, even though our mothers named us both Jonathan and we both chose long ago to go by John, maybe because it was easier to write in longhand, we've decided after a toss of a coin, he's Jonathan for the night, I'm John for the night. Okay. So I'm going to sort of play the role of the MC or director here, because Jonathan's book is going to be the focus of our discussion. But actually, there's a really interesting story to the book that will form the structure of the first part of our discussion, and then in a little while we'll be opening up to questions from you. So we do hope that you will have questions for us. We know that it is folly to invite hundreds of Jews to just submit questions. Thank God you can't speak. You can't like butt in and like start speaking, because you all would. But do think of great questions, and then we'll take them at the appropriate time. So Jonathan and I have both been very concerned, really alarmed about what's happening in the United States, in the government of the United States. Jonathan has written all kinds of brilliant essays on various aspects of it, especially focused on the institutions, what's going wrong with our institutions. But there's an amazing story here that we just pieced together just in the pre-call, just before this session, and it goes like this. So I had the distinct feeling that there was a glitch in the matrix around 2014 or 2015. Something happened. Something was off. Now, we first felt this on university campuses. This became my article and later book, The Coddling of the American Mind. Something was going wrong. We thought it was Gen Z. We thought it was something about kids born in 1995 and later, something about universities, but something got really weird on campus. But then it got weird much wider. We had gigantic outbreaks of right-wing populism around the world. We had what we now call the Great Awakening, which was more on the left in the United States, a shift of especially white liberals very far to the left. Something was really off. And so I was invited to give a lecture at the Manhattan Institute, and I put it all together. I love metaphors, and I put it all together with this metaphor that there are about 23 different constants of the physical universe, and that are true everywhere in our universe. And what would happen if God decided one day that he was just bored? It's been the same 23 constants for 13 billion years. And so if God reached in and said, let's just double the gravitational constant just for fun, let's just see what happens. So I used that metaphor that like something was off about the settings of the universe. So I gave that lecture in 2017. And then things promptly got a lot worse in the United States. But Jonathan saw the lecture or read the transcript of it. And then he liked the idea that it was something about settings, and he made it much more specific. I just made it a metaphor. He actually figured out what the settings are. So Jonathan, over to you. Tell us about what led you to write this book?
So a lot of it begins with your lecture, John. I urge people to go listen to it. It's still brilliant. I had sensed the same thing you had. I remember in 2014, a kind of striking moment when a man named Brandon Ike, who had been named the CEO of Mozilla Corporation, was fired within 10 days after some online activists discovered that 6 years earlier he had given $1,000 to Proposition 8, which rescinded same-sex marriage in California. Now, in 2008, that was the position Barack Obama held. It was the position almost everyone held. But in 2014, it was intolerable. But what was so surprising about this was not only he immediately fired. First, he tried apologizing. That didn't work. Then the company apologized. They said, we must do better. And a bunch of us who favored same-sex marriage at the time wrote an open letter saying, this is wrong. This is not the way we should be conducting things. What we didn't realize is that it wasn't a one-off. It was going to be one of the early examples of what soon became the glitch in the matrix that you noticed. So you give this speech and you say, liberal democracy does not take care of itself. You need to get a lot of settings right. And they're like these natural constants. If you tweak them and you get them wrong, the whole thing can collapse. And I thought about that and I thought, yeah, that's absolutely right. So what are the settings for getting knowledge right? I had long thought that the notion that a marketplace of ideas is, self-sustaining, runs on automatic. Once you have free speech, you're finished. I had always been a bit concerned about that because any undergraduate will ask you, well, how do we know that good ideas will float to the top? And you just have to say, well, trust me, they do. Except suddenly it seemed like they weren't. It seemed like this marketplace was being manipulated by a lot of actors, some of them very political, some of them quite malicious. We had social media coming. So the notion of settings, who's messing with the settings and how, set me off. And I started to think about what are these settings? And as I developed that thinking, I began to realize it was merging with my other stream of work about politics, that there are social settings for how we as a society, as a culture, make knowledge that parallel very closely the social settings in the US Constitution. The Constitution forces us to compromise even when we don't want to in order to make policy. The Constitution of knowledge forces us to persuade even when we don't want to in order to make objective knowledge. And I went on in this vein, and this became the article, The Constitution of Knowledge, which ran about a year after your Manhattan Institute talk, and would become the foundation for later work. But meanwhile, you were still working as well.
Okay, but let's take the time. Oh no, okay, you know what? All right, let's finish the ping pong game, and then we'll go deeper into your book. Okay, so you work out that the settings are especially about the key institutions that that bring us to truth. The key institutions that are nodes in the network that have some quality control: universities, peer review, journalism, editors, certain government agencies, the courts. So we have all of these institutions that that have devolved over centuries and that never do a perfect job, but they are constantly improving. And that's where we should focus. That's what is going wrong. So you really fill out the story, you explain exactly what this is, and then you asked me to read some of the chapters because you cite me a lot in the book. And I'm so busy writing this book on capitalism and doing all my other things. I say, I'd love to, John, I'll give it a try, I'll try. And I put you off for months. And finally, I read those chapters. And, just as you said, a light bulb went off when you read my Manhattan Institute talk. I mean, a lightning bolt struck me when I read those chapters. And I really got alarmed, like, oh my God, he's right. This is what has happened to us. And if this is what has happened, we're in big, big trouble unless we can fix this. We have got to get the Constitution of Knowledge working again. So I have a side interest in social media because I think social media, I've been doing a lot of research on how social media can explain why Gen Z, that is our children and grandchildren who were born after 1995, why they suddenly developed such high rates of depression, anxiety, self-harm, and suicide. Something changed about their social life, about social media. And it's not just, that there's cyberbullying and self-consciousness. The thing I began to focus on more and more is the intimidation. That is, social media, it felt like after 2014, suddenly I started hearing everyone say, I'm walking on eggshells. You didn't hear that in universities in 2012. And Brandon Ike was allowed to be a normal person in 2012. But in 2014, it was like massive intimidation. You said certain activists went to work and they left him as a corpse by the side of the road. And so I'm developing metaphors again. I'm thinking like, what is it? What is it? And the first metaphor that I come to here, so there's two. The first is, it's as though everybody was given a dart gun and they could shoot a dart into anyone in the world. They're not going to kill them, but it hurts. Like, it really would hurt to get, like a needle like stuck into you. And if 10 people shoot you, that would really hurt. And what if everybody had a dart gun, and they were, the key phrase in my new book, I'm writing this book, Life After Babel. The key idea is that reputational destruction was democratized, incentivized, and freed from accountability. In other words, what if social media gave everybody the ability to destroy anyone else's career, or at least to put a pin in them, and then maybe try to get 1,000 other people to put a pin in them? And if you were to be, stung by 1,000 bees, I mean, that would be awful. Now, the only thing that's more awful is to have your reputation to be publicly humiliated, dragged through the mud in front of all the world, and to have your reputation, your career, and your life destroyed. That's worse than getting shot by 1,000 pins. I'm getting a little too abstract and weird here, but the point is, I took Jonathan's idea about it's these key institutions are going wrong, and I'm in one of them, universities. And it was right in 2015 that we all got afraid to speak up. We all got afraid to say what we know is true. And once professors start self-censoring, and someone makes some ridiculous statement, which we know is true, and we just say, and we don't say, no, actually, there's evidence against that. That's when we collapse. And that's what's been happening to us. And it's that feeling of collapse, that we're collapsing, our institutions are collapsing. That's the Babel metaphor. God says in the Tower of Babel story, God says, after the humans, after the flood, they're repopulating, they are spreading out on the plain of Shinar, they build this giant city and this giant tower. And God says, what hubris, because they say this way, God can never kill us again. He can't flood us again. We'll have this tower. So God says, what hubris? And he says, let us go down and confound their language so that they may not understand one another. And so I reread that story while I was mulling this over. I said, oh my God, this is what happened to us. The first tower was destroyed, say 1000 BC or whenever the story would take place. And we gradually rebuilt the tower to the point where we could communicate. We even have Google Translate. We can literally overcome the curse and literally talk to people in real time who speak a different language. What power? But we went too far. We gave everyone the ability to intimidate or harass anyone at any time and to gain prestige for doing so. And in the process, we made our institutions collapse. And so my argument is the Tower of Babel collapsed for the second time between around 2015, and that rolling disaster is rolling through our institutions. And that's what Jonathan has been chronicling as he looked at all the other institutions. So that's this amazing ping pong game of like how we built off of each other's ideas, which will be perfect for a later part of our talk tonight, which will be about Judaism, which has understood from the beginning that knowledge is co-created in social relationships. But that we'll get to in 5 or 10 minutes. So first, it's a little bit deeper dive on Jonathan's book. So tell us, so work it out for the audience. You just briefly alluded to the idea that the Constitution is not just a metaphor, that it really is a constitution. Just go through what that means and what has gone wrong.
Well, a good way to introduce those ideas is by explicating one other round of ping pong, which I'm not even sure I've told you about. So John Haidt writes this book called The Righteous Mind back in, when was it, 2012?
2012.
And I read that and actually commented on it at a public forum and filed it away because it has some very powerful material on it, on human cognitive flaws and the many reasons we get things wrong. And of course, we all assume that we're rational creatures, that we go through life in a rational way and that we master our biases and are aware of them. None of that is true. And psychology has long known that, but especially recently, it's begun to work these things out. Well, what does the US Constitution do? It protects us from the worst side of ourselves. Madison understands that we are ambitious and vain and power-hungry creatures. He understands that we are susceptible to populism, demagoguery, that democracy is an unstable and, in fact, fleeting form of government. But he's a genius. What does he do about this? He says, let's take the very forces that we rely on, the forces that are so destructive, and let's harness them instead. Let's pit ambition against ambition, force each other into having to compromise in order to make policy. Let's distribute power. So you have all these powerful people, but no one's in a position to take charge. So you'll have multiple levels of government. You'll have factions competing with each other. You'll have a dynamic system because you're going to have players always forming new alliances, bringing in new ideas and so forth. I said, well, wait a minute. That's how science works, liberal science. Now, liberal science is not just academic bench science. It's the entire reality-producing, knowledge-seeking community. That's research, academics, scholarship, all the way out to literary criticism and all that stuff. It's also journalism, my field. It's also law. The concept of fact was invented in law, actually before it was invented in modern science, because you needed common facts in order to reach verdicts. And finally, fourth, government. A lot of people think Elvis Presley is alive and living apparently in Indiana, but we don't send him a Social Security check because government has to be based on real knowledge. So the big insight of my book, I think, is it takes Madison's ideas about politics and it says we're applying those same ideas in the realm of knowledge, pitting bias against bias, decentralizing, and building up a lot of institutions to do it. Now, the Constitution of Knowledge is not written down and it doesn't have a Supreme Court, but it's not just a metaphor. It's not just a simile. It is a set of rules and institutions that are deeply inculcated that you, John Haidt, are teaching every time you teach an undergraduate or graduate seminar. And those rules are things like, we'll come back to this when we talk about Judaism. The two biggest are no final say and no personal authority. No final say means no one gets to shut down the debate. It never ends. No prince or dictator or priest can say, it's over, I've got the truth, no one can question it, and you go to jail if you do. And the second is no special authority. That gives you empiricism. That's as much as in the US Constitution, anyone can vote, anyone who meets certain threshold qualities can run for office. Well, anyone can check anyone else's claims. It's not good enough to say, well, I'm Jonathan Rauch and I have insight from God. If I make an argument, if I adduce evidence, you need to be able to check that. And if it doesn't work for you, then something's wrong and we've got to find something more persuasive. So this
actually,
becomes our knowledge baking
system. You do actually have insights from God, but because we can't really know that, so we have to act as though nobody actually does. But please continue.
Yeah. These are rules for how we run society. And then you have lots of institutions, and I described them already. And so the hard work of this book, the thing that I think will, last probably 30,000 years when Aristotle and Plato are forgotten, is it walks through how the Constitution of Knowledge works, how it was founded by generations of scientists and philosophers going back to the time of Isaac Newton and John Locke. It points out it is a deliberate architecture. It didn't just organically grow. It was people making decisions about their society quite consciously, the way the US founders did. And above all, it needs to be understood and defended. And then the book has a big hinge and it gets to the problem that got you and me and other people involved in the first place. What's going wrong? And the book argues you're being manipulated. Yes, social media is an important change technologically, but we can't miss the fact that there are powerful forces in society that are manipulating the system, manipulating the vulnerabilities that you describe in The Righteous Mind deliberately in order to get political gain in politics. That would be, for example, the Russian-style mass disinformation, which Trump and the MAGA movement have used so devastatingly effectively to convince most Republicans that the election was stolen. But it's also the kind of cancel culture creating what are called spirals of silence. If you intimidate people to shut up, they don't know what the people around them really think anymore. And it's very easy to create a kind of cascade where everyone shuts down thinking, well, it's not safe for me to speak. And it becomes self-enforcing and self-propagating. So these are powerful ways of manipulating our vulnerabilities, and they're working.
So no, this is so powerful. Every time I talk to you, I have new insights. That's what's so fun about this. So now I'm seeing I've read your work, I've talked with you, but as you describe the Madisonian genius, and apologies to our Canadian audience, I assume they know who James Madison was, one of the founding fathers and the main architect of the U.S. Constitution. But to have this image of like two big, strong, nasty men, fighting it out or pushing against each other, the worst aspects of our nature for these people and the worst aspects of our nature for these people, they cancel out in the sense that you can't get anything done until you can go through, So you have this content, you have ambition pitted against ambition, as he said. And then we imagine that one of the guys is suddenly shot full of little pins because all these little creatures, these little Lilliputian creatures, everyone has the ability to shoot little pins into one of them, not the other, just one. And so this guy folds up and stops pushing because it's just too painful. And now we've unleashed this monster. And so I suddenly had this vision, which I haven't had before, of of what happened in 2015. It was this Madisonian balance, which you can visualize as two sort of, almost like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde thing, where you take all the worst aspects of it. That's Mr. Hyde. And all of our Mr. Hydes are pushing against each other, and suddenly half of them drop dead and the other half just are unleashed. And that's what it felt to be. That's what it felt like to be a professor in university. And the funny thing, and I hope we'll come to this in the questions, and actually I'll ask the audience this right now, is parts of this story are universal across the Western democracies. Parts are particular to the United States, especially Jonathan has been focusing on what happened with Trump and the Republican Party. How did they kind of lose their minds? But in universities, very much the same thing happened in Canada and the UK in 2015, 2016. It all started all over the English-speaking world. I was in Australia and New Zealand in 2019, and it happened there too, only about 2 or 3 years later. It took a little while for things to get over there, but all the English-speaking countries are going through the exact same thing, even though pieces of the story are uniquely, our crazy, ridiculous country. Let's see. Okay, so Jonathan, we'll get to Judah in just a moment, but what are the proposals that you have in the book, or what is it that we need to do in the United States, or what can you tell our Canadian neighbors to say, don't let this happen to you. These forces will come to you if they're not already consuming you. What advice do you have?
Well, this is the hardest thing about talking about this book, is that this is not one of those situations where you repeal, I don't know, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act to deal with it, or you break up Facebook, or you do 2 or 3 other things and you're done. This is not the first epistemic crisis that Western society has faced. The first and maybe greatest of them was the invention of the printing press. Now, that led to 150 years of war that killed like 30% of the population of today's Germany. So that tells you how dangerous these situations can be. But we had another one in the 19th century in America, the development of offset printing, which, these are these huge printing presses that allow newspapers to roll off the presses, and you can print 100,000 in a night. This set off a race to the bottom in journalism in America. So by the end of the century, journalism was just rife with extreme hyperpartisanship and fake news. So what did we do about it then? I'm sorry, it's going to be a slightly long reply, but there's a bunch in it. There's no other way. Yeah. So what do we do about that? Well, it wasn't just one thing, but first the industry began to realize that it had become toxic to its own environment, to its customer base, to its society. And you began to see the development of institutions that developed new norms, new rules. The American Society of Newspaper Editors, founded in the early 20th century, the first thing it does is promulgate some norms, some ethics codes, like don't accept pay from your sources, seek comment before you write something, that's run a correction if you're wrong. Now, these seem very basic today, but someone had to come up with them because they were not standard practice. Then you had the development at the same time, journalism schools begin to arise, and they begin inculcating a new class of professional journalists with these kinds of norms and passing that on. You get the professionalization of newsrooms. You get something also very important, the development of prizes like the Pulitzer, and one that I'm honored to say I won, the National Magazine Award, which incentivized good behavior. But there's lots of little incentives too. Like if you get a big story and you're correct, other people will pick it up and people will say good things about you. The same thing happens in medicine, for example, which goes from folk medicine practicing a lot of garbage to a professional organization where people are incentivized for doing good work. The same thing happens in academia. Research universities are set up around the same time. What do all these have in common? They're institutional structures and norms that channels people's behavior and say, okay, we realize we have a problem with bad behavior. How can we restrict ourselves and turn a vicious cycle, the race to the bottom of social media, for example, to a race to the top where you switch the incentives, like in the newspaper business, they start producing a more truthful product. They start retraining their audiences to want that product And within 2 generations, we go from the yellow press and William Randolph Hearst to Edward R. Murrow. So another disruption today, they're all different, but what it's going to have to be is lots of different institutions in society, everything from social media companies to journalism outlets to universities, and even individuals, figuring out what adjustments they can make in their environment to respond to the threats we now see, to incentivize better conduct and reward better conduct, and to immunize themselves against the tsunami of disinformation. You'll never have a perfect answer, but it turns out, for instance, you don't need to ban people from Facebook if you just move something that's not true or isn't fact-checked lower in people's feed. You slow the velocity of its repetition by about 70%. Well, you think of that ping-ponging through the system, that gives you time to react, and often it just makes the thing die out completely. Twitter is already experimenting with interstitial warnings, for example, that will stop you if you try to tweet a link you haven't read. Well, that seems minor, but those are the kinds of incentives that a psychologist will tell you, I think, I'm talking to one, will slow people down and move us a little bit off our lizard brains and give us some restraint. So it's going to be a lot of things like that at a lot of different levels. The good news is we're already seeing developments that are positive in a lot of different spheres. The bad news is we still have a heck of a long way to go, and it's a wicked hard problem. And we're dealing with a thinking enemy. These folks, Donald Trump and his crew are the best information manipulators, the most gifted, and I think malicious propaganda actors since the 1930s. So we're up against some really formidable foes here.
Well, that is powerful, and that is clear that there is no easy answer. You talked about some small things like Twitter putting a little bit of friction in retweets. Those things will help. But what I take from what you just said and what I take from the book is that the real heavy lifting is going to be heavy lifting. And it is changes in institutions. Each institution has to figure out its own way to change, to reestablish norms that incentivize quality over quantity or mass likes or clicks, things like that. And this is a perfect segue into Judaism now, because when we talk about the norms that take imperfect people and put them together in a kind of a practice that leads to something far more perfect or closer to truth. Who got there first? The Jews. And my synagogue in New York City is Central Synagogue. Rabbi Angela Buchdahl is just brilliant. And she, like most rabbis, it seems, at least certainly most Reform rabbis, is dealing with the fact that whatever she says about Israel, someone's going to get mad at her. And she's been trying to keep together a congregation. It leans left overall, but not nearly as far left as some other synagogues. So there are some actual conservatives in our synagogue, which is a very good thing. But on Israel, it's very difficult. So she's been wrestling with this as the leaders of almost every institution have, just increased division within the institution. And she's been reflecting on Jewish wisdom here, as I've been studying John Stuart Mill and the importance of free speech, and I've been active on how do we protect freedom of speech and inquiry on campus. And so in talking with Rabbi Buchdahl, I've learned some amazing Talmud quotes, and she gave the most incredible sermon on Yom Kippur this year. In fact, I hope there's I'm going to put the link here. I have the link right here. I'm going to put it in the chat, and I don't know. I'm not sure if I can reach. Let's see if I can reach everyone. I'm going to try it. I'm going to just see if this reaches everyone. And if not, then our hosts who are running the technology behind us can perhaps send it out. But this amazing sermon she gave, titled "Why Jews Value Dissent," and she opens with the trite story: if you have 2 Jews, you'll have 3 opinions. But it's not just that we have lots of opinions; it's that if you have 2 Jews, you put them together into a Havruta, the tradition of having Jews study the Talmud and the Torah. They study it in pairs, and they debate and they argue. And in that way, they come to a 3rd opinion, which is better than either of the 2 original ones. And the Talmud is full of such stories. I won't tell the long story about Rabbi Yohanan and his student Reish Lakish. I'll just get to the punchline of it. They argue, they fight, it's great. Reish Lakish dies, the rabbi is inconsolable. He's lost his friend, he's lost his conversation partner. The members of his congregation, they find him another partner. It's a brilliant scholar. And as Rabbi Yohanan works with this scholar, the scholar finds all kinds of citations to back up what the rabbi is saying. And the rabbi is inconsolable. He says, no, this is terrible. This is not what I wanted. And he says, in my discussions with Reish Lakish, when I would state a matter, he would raise 24 difficulties against me in an attempt to disprove my claim. And I would answer him with 24 answers. And the law by itself would become broadened and clarified. That is, it was the argument, the fight, the debate that brings forth the law. And then he says, and yet you say to me, there is a ruling that supports your opinion. Do I not know that what I say is good? Being rebutted by Reish Lakish served a purpose. Your bringing proof to my statements does not. And this is the Jewish way, that you are part of a long tradition that is based on a book. And it's not just any book. It's a book that includes the dissent. And what other religion has done this? Rabbi Buchdahl pointed out in 325, the Council of Christian Bishops codified a doctrine called the Nicene Creed. It established unity of beliefs and rituals mandated across the Christian world. They said, this is what we believe. No Jew would ever say that. Judaism would never do that. Judaism doesn't say that. Judaism says, this is how we argue. That's what Judaism is. And in the process, it's Madisonian. It's positively Madisonian. And of course, the Jews got there thousands of years ago. So I'll just pass. So I've been so excited by this, and I'll just pass it over. Jonathan, is it?
Well, yeah, me too.
Is it exactly Madisonian? What do you think?
It's not exactly Madisonian. Madison is more interested in institutions, and he's more interested in politics, but the fundamentals are the same. And doing this conversation and preparing for it and thinking about it actually brought me closer to understanding the parallels between the two. So you remember the two linchpins of the Constitution of Knowledge: no final say, no personal authority. So Jewish tradition has both of those things. No personal authority means in science, you have to be able to persuade any reasonable person regardless of their identity, right? You're not just talking to one person or people who are agreeing with you. You have to talk to people who disagree with you. And you may not convince them, but over time, the community will come to some kind of adjudication about who is more right and who is more wrong. And that's how you decide in science. Well, does that sound familiar? Sure does. And then the other rule, no final say. So this is called fallibilism in philosophy. It goes back to, well, quite a while, but in its modern form to Charles Sanders Peirce about 150 years ago. And this is the radical doctrine that what we know, objective knowledge, is not the same as truth, because we can never be 100% certain we've got truth. We just approach it. But objective knowledge is not what we're certain of. It's what we're uncertain of. But it's what on any given day we're relatively more certain of, right? If something is dogmatic and unquestionable and so certainly true that you can't discuss it, it can't be objective knowledge because it's not part of this game of conversation. So who comes up with the notion of no final say? I'm going to go toe to toe with you on stories from Jewish lore.
Okay, let's hear it.
I won't read it. I'll just recite it and I'll get it kind of wrong, but I'll get the gist right. So Rabbi Joshua and Rabbi Eliezer are having an argument about some extremely fine point of kashrut involving an oven. And Rabbi Eliezer says, look, I've made my arguments and I'm right. And if I'm right, may that plant over there show it. And the plant is magically uprooted from its roots. And Rabbi Eliezer says, when that doesn't convince people, if I'm right, may that aqueduct show it. And the direction of water flowing in the aqueduct switches. And people still aren't convinced. Rabbi Eliezer says, look, if I'm right, may the walls of this study room cave in. Well, that's kind of dangerous. The walls don't cave in, but they begin to bend about halfway. That doesn't convince them. So he finally says, look, if I'm right, God can just tell us I'm right. And sure enough, a voice from heaven says, Rabbi Eliezer is right. Why are you doubting him? At which point Rabbi Joshua says, what business is this of yours to God? He says, the Torah was given to us. It's our job to interpret it. Stay out of this. The follow-up is that an angel goes to God and asks how God feels about this. And God responds, my people have triumphed over me, with a smile.
Wow.
So what's this telling us? In Judaism, it's all up to us, right? Yeah. Not even God can stop the argument.
Wow. It's all up to us. I mean, what a story full of disobedience, disrespect, but the disrespect, but it's respect. It would seem disrespect in some traditions to not accept the authority. But the point is, you're not, of course you should show personal respect to your elders. But part of being a Jew is that personal respect to your elders does not mean you just say, okay, you said it, you're the authority, I accept it. Wow.
And we question, at some level, we question even God.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, that would be incomprehensible in many traditions, but I think it's kind of something unique that Judaism gave to the world, and it gave it to me, frankly. I grew up with, at being an atheist homosexual Jew, you're an outsider. I say I was born canceled. Because you just can't take anything for granted, and none of the standard scripts apply. But a lot of who I am is from that questioning spirit, which was always inculcated in me.
I know nothing about your childhood, especially not your Jewish upbringing. Was it, mine was just a very stereotypical, grandparents came over from Europe, that were in the garment business in New York City. Parents were highly assimilated, moved out to the suburbs. I was raised in a Reform congregation. I had a bar mitzvah, but after that, had no interest and became an atheist by the age of 14. So never thought about the religion, but still was very proud of being Jewish ethnically, culturally and ethnically. I was proud of being Jewish. And it sort of got into me, growing up in a very Jewish part of the country in New York suburbs. What was your background? I don't actually know.
Exactly the same, except in Phoenix, Arizona, because my father, my father's mother emigrated from the Vale somewhere in Poland now. Who knows what the sovereign was then, in 1910, and lived on welfare in New York City. My father went to Yale Law School but couldn't get a job because of anti-Semitism. There were quotas on Jews in the Eastern firms, so he moved to Phoenix, Arizona. But I came up in as part of a community of a conservative shul. And I knew from very young, I don't know how I knew it, but from very young, I knew that the idea of God seemed crazy to me. Like, what, this like big magical figure in the sky running the universe with me in mind and using magic to create. I just thought, this is like, I'm a 10-year-old who thinks it's infantile. And it never took. I tried at one point. I donned tefillin once at religious camp, day after day, and really tried, but it didn't take. Yet somehow I understood that that's not the core of Judaism, that it's about the community, it's about the way of thinking, it's about the sense of humor. And that's still where I am. It's for me, it's a patrimony, really, and it's a community, and it's this way of thinking that you and I and some other folks who I think are probably Jewish are also trying to advance in this very dark time.
That's right. I think in a sense, Jews were pre-adapted. This way of thinking, this Jewish way of thinking and arguing and questioning made us pre-adapted to fit into certain professions. And I just read some astonishing statistic about the percentage. If you look at all of the top law schools in the United States, the percentage of professors at the top law schools, I think it was 40%, some astonishing number in a country that's roughly 2% Jewish, to have 40% of the law professors be Jewish. So in law, in my field, in the academy, not in all disciplines, but in certain social sciences and humanities, and then in your field, in journalism.
A bit less in my field. There's another connection too, though, John, and this goes to your important work on Heterodox Academy and your work on free speech, which is the extraordinary role that Jews have played for, well, forever, but especially in the last 50 years in defending the dissident, in defending freedom of speech,
Right.
in defending heterodoxy. Again and again, we see that leaders of, for example, the American Civil Liberties Union have been Jewish, including Jews who defended the right of Nazis to march in Skokie. We see that, I think, a fair amount on campus. And something I worry about, this is another way in which your your work influenced me so much, is understanding the tenuous hold that concepts of free speech and diversity of belief have in the core of our intellectual institutions. And I just kind of feel like, I hope this doesn't sound grandiose, but to me as a Jew, and as a gay man born in a very different country, that ideas, speech, the ability to dissent, to ask questions, to push people to come up with better arguments if they're saying things that are stupid and oppressive, that this is everything to me. This is what gave me, I'm married now to a man. That's inconceivable.
Inconceivable
and that
20 years
comes,
ago, 30 years ago, yeah.
And that comes from the process of it took decades, but arguing and arguing and arguing. People would say, same-sex marriage it's sinful, it's going to destroy the family, it's, gay people can't do it because of the way, all kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And the arguments won because they were right. So it breaks my heart now as a member of several historically oppressed minorities to see so many activists on campus who are minorities believing that freedom of speech and intellectual discipline and diversity, that these things are somehow repressive or oppressive or conservative concepts.
Right. It's white supremacy culture being championed in order to suppress other people, when in fact just the reverse is true. So we're going to open up for questions in about 8 minutes. I just want to ask you one other question, which is, I'm thinking a lot, I'm a college professor. So far I've been teaching mostly MBA students, but I'll be teaching undergrads again soon. And I have my own children are 11 and 15, and my son is beginning to find out in high school that there are certain classes in which he has to be very careful what he says. He can't question things or he'll get in trouble. And he asked me the other day, what should he do? Should he just go along? And before I tell you what I told him, which wasn't satisfactory, but I'd love to hear what you would say to him. And I'm asking this in part because I'm imagining that the audience on this call right now is mostly older people, probably not a lot of 18 to 21-year-olds on the call, but most people on the call probably have children or grandchildren who are in Gen Z, who were born after 1995. And this talk will be posted online. Let's hope that some people can drag their grandchildren in it, although I guess we can imagine they wouldn't be very positively disposed if they're dragged. But anyway, what, so if you had a group of 18-year-old kids, let's say some of them were LGBTQ, some of them were activists, some of them were concerned about the environment, or they were feminists, or what would you say to them?
Well, if I've given some mighty long filibusters here, but would it be okay if I frame that by just backing up and setting the stage a little bit about what I think you and I and others are seeing in now campus environments and now increasingly in high schools?
You set it up however you want, and then you knock it down. Go ahead.
So 1993, I write a book called Kindly Inquisitors, The New Attacks on Free Thought. And one of the big things it's about is academic theorists and administrators who are coming up with new concepts like words that wound, which equate criticism or speech that's deemed offensive with physical violence, and that's a human rights violation. And I argue against that. But it's kind of coming from, and we've got university speech codes, so it's kind of coming from the top down. It's ideological. And then I go away, I work on gay marriage, I do other things. and groups like FIRE and Heterodox come along and begin to move the needle on college campuses. And then what you and I and others detect really starts to change about 6 or 7 years ago is the source of the pressure changes to something we never expected. It's coming now from the bottom up. It's peer pressure. I don't know about NYU, but both anecdotal evidence and now lots of survey evidence finds that students are afraid of each other. They're afraid of being ganged up on, dragged, their reputation demolished. No one sits with them at lunch, all the social media stuff. And it's shutting down their ability to think that they can contribute in classes. Professors are complaining about this. They're saying they have to drag it out of students. Even though it's no longer the case that I think that there's a big problem with left-wing professors indoctrinating students. Most professors, including progressive professors, are doing their best to elicit multiple points of view in their classroom and having trouble doing it. So this is creating an environment that Alexis de Tocqueville called it the biggest threat to freedom in America in 1835. That's people are too afraid of social punishment to speak their mind. John Stuart Mill, 1859, says the biggest threat to freedom in Britain is not from the government, it's from a culture of conformity. That's what we're seeing on campus, a culture of imposed conformity and of fear. The polls show it. 2/3 of students say they're afraid to give their true political opinions for fear of social repercussions. So this is a hard problem because you can't pass a law and deal with it. And it's asking a lot of one individual to stick their head above the parapet, knowing that they're then a target for a bunch of activists who can slam them with those darts that you were talking about. So it's got to be two things at once. You've got to work both sides of it at once. First, you need institutional support for these kids. You need leaders at your son or daughter, I forget, your kid's high school who will back them, who will make it a policy to back them. You especially need that, though, in universities, which are dedicated to open thought and expression in a way that high schools are not. And that's going to require institutional change, and stuff like Heterodox Academy is looking for adoption of the Chicago principles, improving diversity on faculties, training, including First Amendment education in orientation, all kinds of things like that. And some universities are starting to do that. But with that institutional support, then there's the individual side. It is really hard, but the answer has to be, at the end of the day, unmute yourself. So I spoke earlier about information warfare, the manipulation of the information environment to intimidate or disorient and so forth. What all of these things are trying to do ultimately is demoralize the target population, whether it's Vladimir Putin trying to divide American society, whether it's Donald Trump trying to confuse us with so many lies that we give up and we no longer know what's true, or whether it's canceling in universities that make a professor or a student feel like there's no point speaking up, I'll just get slaughtered. So how do you change that? Well, it turns out you can reverse these spirals of silence pretty quickly if just a few people stand up and insist on being heard. It's not even what they say, it's that they say. When others then see that it is possible to defy these thought police, some of them will join in. Now it's hard, right? Because you can't count on that. It's a heavy burden to place on an individual. All I can say is all of society benefits if some courageous individuals, like maybe your child, is willing to say, you know what, I refuse to be silenced.
Wow.
What are you going to tell
that
your,
is beautiful.
your kid? So what are you going to say?
Yeah, so he just came to me with this just 2 days ago, and I should have had an answer as inspiring as yours. But he's my kid, and he is concerned about getting into college, and he needs not just good grades, but he needs the recommendation from this one particular teacher. And so I see it as a moral dilemma, and I didn't want to put too much pressure on him. But I said, so rule number one, never lie. never ever say something that you think is untrue. Rule number 2, always assume good intent. Always start by assuming that the teacher and everyone else is well-intentioned, and they're not out to get you, and they sincerely believe what they believe for good reasons. And rule number 3, and this comes right out of the Righteous Mind, something I've been saying for many years, always start by acknowledging something that they're right about. And you can always find something they're right about, because that right away, they can't stereotype you as, oh, just another, because people want to put you in a box quickly, and especially if they can put you in a box like, oh, you're just, a right-wing idiot or something. But if you start by saying, I think you're right about this, that creates some not pressure, but some opening for reciprocity, and it won't always work. And so I didn't say unmute yourself, stand up for what you think is right. I gave him more cautious advice, which is never lie. And if you're going to stand up, here are some rules to not get your head blown off. And that's where I left it in our first conversation. And because I'm not sure what to say beyond that. And I guess in part, it's going to depend on how he evolves and what he sees in the class. And especially, I did say, look for allies. So
Yes,
he needs
I was
to know,
going to say, look for allies.
Yeah. So he needs to know, is he alone? Or where are there 4 or 5 other kids who might stand up with him? And so your advice about a spiral of silence is very helpful here, because one person standing up is a suicide mission. But if you have 4 or 5, it's like that. What's the old song? One person. Alice's Restaurant. One person, it's crazy. 2 is a conspiracy. 3 is a movement, or something like that. But anyway, okay.
Well, that all seems about right. And maybe something else to add is that if he's put in a position of being bullied or hammered, that you will go to the mat for him, that he has recourse in that situation, and he will not be fighting alone. There's, I guess it's time to go to the audience, but one of the most famous psychology experiments ever, as you very well know, is Solomon Asch.
Yes.
And I won't go through it all, but what he finds is the power of group conformity is such that if everyone in the room is against you, you'll conform in many, many cases, because either you don't want the trouble of speaking out, or you're actually convinced that you might be wrong. That's even right. If all the other people in the room are also doing the same thing, they're also falsifying their opinion out of fear. That's the spiral of silence. But if you alter the experimental parameters so that only one other person in the room agrees with you, the conformism plummets. It falls to 5 or 10%. So you don't need everyone in the school to agree with you. But if you can find a few allies and a few supporters, and do it the way you said, not looking for a fight, not trolling. Yeah, individuals can make a big difference.
Yeah, I think you're right. And we've seen many examples of that. When people do stand up, sometimes they get their heads bitten off, but other times they start a movement. And the one thing I've seen really common repeatedly is the people who bend, who bow down, who make these Maoist apologies, formulaic apologies, like Brandon Ike tried to do, they always look terrible afterwards.
Never works.
We can have it doesn't work, and they humiliate themselves. They look terrible afterwards. Of course, we can have sympathy with them. We understand why they do that, but the pressure is intense in the short term. But if you are dignified and principled, in the long run, you almost always come out looking well.
Yeah, and Judaism comes in here too, as well, at least for me, because I always understood myself in part of a tradition in which I had a duty to the argument, not just to myself.
The argument, love it.
And not even just to the community, but a duty to try to get it right. And if I had to push the community, to push the community. And that's what we did on gay marriage. When we started, that was a completely hopeless, quixotic campaign. I didn't think I'd see it in my lifetime, frankly.
Yeah,
but people would be amazed. It's not that radical activist in the room. You never convince them if you're your son or whoever. It's the quiet people in the room who are listening, who are comparing the rational and sensible things that you're saying with the crazy extreme things that the other people are saying. They're going to leave the room thinking.
So those are brilliant analyses of the dynamics of what's really going on in these complex conflicts. Okay, so we have one question submitted. I'll just read it out loud. In Quebec today, the government and its leader have said numerous times that any criticism of a new law, which would do away with judicial requirement for search and seizure over language issues, and the law in general, is contrary to the human rights laws, and charters of both the province and the country. The leader and government call any critique or dissent as radical and anti-Quebec, and being against Quebec and its people. What is your review and recommendation? Okay, so this is going to be a tough one for us to weigh in on if we don't know the details of this. I don't know if you were able to, if you know enough about this or have any thoughts about this. Otherwise,
I know about the pattern of which it's part, because the United States, thanks to our First Amendment, in the annals of human government, a truly bizarre concoction, is quite unique. Other countries, free countries, democracies, have limits on hate speech of various kinds, and Canada is one of them. So does Europe. Because these are free and open societies on the whole, those laws can be abused, but they're not the end of freedom. But in Canada, so when Canada instituted laws, very sweeping laws about pornography based on feminist theory, what was the first thing the Canadian authorities did? They went to a place called the Glad Day Bookstore, which was the main gay and lesbian bookshop in Toronto, and they raided it. And they cleared the shelf of gay and lesbian literature because it was pornographic. So you've got to be careful about giving the authorities these tools. They are used inevitably against minorities. And they are used especially against viewpoint minorities. Protecting dissidents is maybe the most important kind of minority to protect, because that's where we get the questions that give us the new knowledge. It's where we poke society's conscience and do things like end the oppression or reduce the oppression of gay people. So in general, I think that these laws are a bad idea. I think they're easy to abuse. And one of the reasons they're easy to abuse, John, is a point you just make, which is these are not evil people who are out to turn society into some kind of Orwellian dictatorship. These are good people who think they're doing the right thing by shutting down hate speech, but don't realize that many great ideas, probably most great important ideas, begin sounding hateful to someone.
That's right, because if it's offensive, many young people learn how to interpret it as hate speech. The boundaries keep expanding, and that's right. And once you release this power out there.
Yeah, you pointed this out, the psychology of this and the coddling of the American mind, which is, it's not just political abuse, it's that you start to train people to look to be offended, to want to be offended, to dial up to offendedness and outrage instead of down to annoyance or just ignoring it, because there's a social reward for that and there's a big fuss about it, and for the other reasons that you've talked about.
Yeah, that's right. And this is what I'm hearing from leaders in so many fields now, that met some of their young employees, the Gen Z employees. It's like they're looking for something to be outraged about, and they spend endless time because somebody said something to someone, and now it becomes a whole company-wide matter. Right, here's the question. Should courses be developed to encourage diverse thinking and praise and reward informed truth, and not be afraid to stand up for what you believe to be right and be ready to accept that someone may have a better solution than yours? And I guess the question is, what is there a kind of a course that we could give in high school or college that might prepare students to do what you said, or to be better participants in the process? What do you think?
You should answer that, because I think that work is happening, right? And aren't you involved in one or more of the organizations that are actually teaching discursive methods, showing students how to disagree agreeably and so forth?
Yes.
Maybe you could describe that.
Don't mind if I do, sure. So I thought, so in 2014, 2015, I became active. I co-founded an organization called Heterodox Academy. And if anyone on this call, if anyone watching this is a professor or an administrator at university, please go to heterodoxacademy.org and join us. It's free. We're actually politically balanced, it happens. And we're all about the process. We believe that viewpoint diversity is necessary. So it started as a project just for professors. But now it's become clear, very soon after 2014, 2015, it became clear that actually something's going really wrong with the students, with the undergrads. And Greg and I, in our original article and book, we said, well, students should, get involved in debate. Like if you, do formal debate, that'll teach you how to look on both sides, and it'll teach you how to be involved. Well, it turns out that's wrong, because debate has now been taken over by social justice activism, and you don't win by making arguments. You win by trying to trump someone else's social justice claim to show that you are woker than they are. So some courses can be taken over. Even debate is not necessarily going to teach kids this. So what we did, Caroline Mell, a woman who was working for me as a research assistant originally at the time, I'd had this idea that we actually need to expose college students to the best arguments on right, left, and libertarian. Because it's easy. Social media will give you the worst arguments from the other side, but it won't give you the best. So we created a program called Open Mind, and if you go to openmindplatform.org, it's a program. It's ideal for high school seniors. I wouldn't go down to middle school, but for once you're at 16, 17 years old, or high school or college freshmen, sophomores, it's ideal. It also works well in companies, any organization really, and it teaches you the psychology, some of the psychology that Jonathan was just talking about. It teaches you skills of starting a conversation. How do you build rapport first? How should you open? And so we created this program as an adjunct to help anybody, any teacher who's teaching difficult or controversial material. If you start the course off by assigning Open Mind, you'll find that the course goes better. We also find that there is a lot of interest among high school teachers. But again, as you said, Jonathan, it all depends on, do you have support from above? Many high school principals and many heads of school do believe in open education and viewpoint diversity, but a lot of them are so afraid, especially here in New York City. It's amazing. All of the top private schools have gone in the same direction. People are afraid to speak, they're blowing up. But there are schools here and there where the leadership actually thinks you should welcome diverse opinions. And so if you have that leadership, then there are all kinds of courses you can teach on the history of free speech, but start at openmindplatform.org. That's the place to start. We've got a library of materials there as well.
Yeah, and abstracting just one level above that, openmind.org is not the only one. It turns out that critical thinking skills can be taught. And colleges are starting to do that. And there are also other courses and programs, like there's something called the Moral Courage College, which is led by Irshad Manji, which has started up, which teaches how to have uncomfortable conversation. There's something called sustainedialogue.org. I'm part of a movement. I think actually John is too. You may still be on the board, called Braver Angels.
Yes, we just had a board meeting today.
And Braver Angels is a national grassroots depolarizing movement that starts by taking reds and blues, and it doesn't have a debate where they try to persuade each other, but it does put them in a structured context where they learn how to listen to each other and humanize each other. And they do that both through workshops and now increasingly through Braver Angels debates. I'm not with you, John, on debate. I think it's a great thing because it forces people to hear the other side and argue often the other side. And all of these things are, in fact, helping reduce the temperature, teach the skills, and back students off of this training they're getting, that the more outraged you are, the more virtuous you are. So yeah, thank you, questioner. This can be taught, and it should be taught.
Yeah. Jonathan, do you, tell us the story of how Braver Angels came to be. How did David Blankenhorn get the idea of doing this long ago? If you were involved in that.
Oh, I don't know. It might have had a little bit to do with me. I think you're fishing.
It's an amazing story.
Here.
I sure am. It's an amazing story. Please tell.
Do we have time? We don't have too many questions to.
Yeah, no, there's only a couple of this, and also to the audience, please do submit more questions. I have a couple of ones that I'll get to in a moment.
How long do we go to? We've got.
We go till 9. We have to stop. We close up in 11 minutes. We close up in 11 minutes. We pass it back to.
Okay, so we do have time for a couple more questions, and we'd love to get them. So my other career is as an advocate for same-sex marriage, and I wrote a book about it. and immediately ran into a character named David Blankenhorn, who ran a family values think tank in New York and was the most articulate opponent of same-sex marriage. And I liked him as a person, though he was wrong on this issue, but we began doing a series of debates and conversation. And I'll be darned if one day in 2012, after doing this a number of years, he didn't turn up in Washington and said over lunch, you know what, I think I was wrong on same-sex marriage, and I'm going to say so in the New York Times. And you could have, picked me up off the floor. And he has since become an advocate of same-sex marriage and said he was wrong. But if you'll ask him, he says, I think, John, what you and other cognitive psychologists say, which is the arguments are important, but they provide ammunition for the change of heart that's often already occurred, right? It's the elephant somehow had moved out from under him. This is your famous simile about, it's really the elephant underneath us, the mind that we don't, the intuition, the moral intuition that moves first. And knowing gay people like me, hearing our stories, changed his frame of mind so that he became receptive to a change of opinion. Now, so he started Braver Angels because he was horrified by polarization and knew psychologists who knew how to reduce that. And that's what he's working on. And I should say, for those of you who are alarmed by what I just said, Braver Angels does not ever try to change anyone's mind about anything. And neither do these other programs.
It's
that
about
John
the
and I can
process
talk
and the
about.
Relationships. It's
Right.
about going through a process together, which actually builds relationships, which is exactly what happened with you and David. So it's a beautiful story.
And that's a Jewish thing too, of course, right? Arguments
right.
the core of our relationship.
That's right. And he is an evangelical Christian. Okay, we have a question here. Do you have any comments on Aquinas's advice? Never deny, seldom confirm, always distinguish, and scholastic debate.
I don't think those are particularly good rules. Do you? I'm more of the camp that says, if you're wrong, admit it. Try to approach a conversation or a subject. You can't be open-minded and stick to your guns if you think you're right, but listen to the other side. So I don't know. Those kinds of rubrics don't really work for me. Maybe I'm not understanding though, because Aquinas was a smart guy. So maybe you should answer this, John.
Okay. You know what? It doesn't resonate with me either, but I've got a Jewish version from my advisor, my postdoctoral advisor. Was one of the most brilliant people I've ever known, one of the most influential cultural psychologists, a man named Richard Schwader. And he tells the story of how he has a brother-in-law who is a dermatologist, and he says, the basic rule of dermatology is, if it's wet, you make it dry. If it's dry, you make it wet. And he takes this rule into intellectual life by saying, if someone asserts it, try denying it and see if that works. If someone denies it, try asserting it and see if that works. And lo and behold, it usually does. So whenever people make a statement, in your mind, suppose, if they say, well, of course, we all know X, try saying, well, what about not X? What about the opposite of X? You raise your hand, you say, well, but couldn't it be not X? And don't just, if you just do that all the time, you're annoying. But if you think about it, you'll often find, actually, here's an argument for why it is not X. And when you do that, then all views get aired, all views get challenged, and the ones that emerge are the strongest. So I think, I'll go with Richard Schwader rather than Thomas Aquinas. Okay, let's see. There's a question over in the chat. Okay, let's try this one. We've had many examples in the last few years on university campuses of intimidation on the issue of Israel and the Palestinians. This is a recurring problem, and Jewish students are often silenced. How can these students stand up to this in a way that actually is effective, since most of the time there's no benefit or any change of opinions? What do you think?
Well, why do we assume there's no benefit and no change of opinions? Remember, the mind that you're trying to change is not the most strident person on the other side of the argument. They're probably not changeable because they're probably got an identity that's tied up with their viewpoint, and they lose face with their group if they change their mind. So they can't really. What you're trying to do is make a calm and coherent but firm case for those other people out there who may be quiet, but who are listening. And even if you don't persuade them, just speaking up, just speaking out asserts your right to be part of the conversation.
Mm.
And that's very important. Now, I believe intimidation, which is one form of canceling, part and parcel of it, has no place in academic discourse or any other discourse. But, you know, we live in the real world, right? So we certainly know it happens. And it's important. So this goes back to what I said earlier, but I face this problem. I was talking on college campuses all the time, and I got the same question again and again, usually from a white cisgender freshman or sophomore who would say, it's really frustrating. I try to speak out about whatever it is, and I'm told to check my privilege, and that because of who I am, I should not participate in the conversation. What do I do? So at first I tried preparing snappy comebacks, and that flopped because it's so situational. And then I tried the cop-out, saying, you know what? Your generation has to figure that out. I can't tell you. That was even worse. Mm. And then what I finally came down on as the right answer, I think, is, you know, it doesn't matter what you say. What matters is that you say. Remember, the whole point of these manipulations of the social environment are to shut you down and shut you up, make you lose your confidence, feel ashamed of your viewpoint, and just put your head down and go away. They win if you do that. So don't do that.
Yeah. I think that's it. I think that's very powerful advice. To return on the Israel-Palestine question, I think there is a real issue of intimidation. I've been to talks, I've seen videos of Jewish students getting physically punched, I mean, literally beaten up for attending events, physically threatened. And so I think this is a huge failure of the university leadership, that they don't punish these actions severely. Any student who engages in any kind of physical threat or physical attack should be expelled instantly, I think. Well, of course, with due process. So when there's true danger of physical attack, it is much harder. But I think if you have some support from leadership, if on your campus people aren't literally getting beaten up, although of course, look, Jews have been getting attacked for hundreds or thousands of years and have still stood up. But in the vast majority of cases, the risk is not being punched in the face. The risk is social. And I think you're right that even if you're going to be shouted down, even if you won't be able to reach people, that's not a reason to not speak. It's not what you say, it's that you say. And as soon as you stop saying, because what's the use, or they'll just shout me down, then they win.
And there are off-campus resources that people could explore. Foundation for Individual Rights and Education does good work, and others. And I should add that I have read reports of intimidation flowing the other direction in the Israel-Palestine debate. Now, I have not explored this personally, so I don't know how frequently or whether these reports are true or how frequently it happens. But it should go without saying that Jews should be the last people on the world to be using these silencing tactics. So if some of us are,
that's right, please
stop. You know, it breaks my heart like nothing else that so many people in minority communities, of which I'm part, the gay and lesbian world, seem to be moving in an intolerant direction and trying to stigmatize people. For example, religious people who disagree with us in the same way that we were stigmatized, driving them out of polite society. And we weren't fighting for just our ability to live out and speak out as our true selves with integrity. We were fighting for everyone's ability to do that. So we must be as tolerant to them as they never were to us.
That is beautiful. And that's what the platinum rule. We should treat people as we want to be treated. And keeping in mind that your goal is not necessarily to persuade the person you're arguing with. Your goal is to provide an example, which will be an inspiring example. You may not change that one mind, but you might touch 1,000 hearts. And so unmute yourself, speak up. What matters is not just what you say, it's that you say. And on that note, I hope this has been an inspiring session with Jonathan Rauch and his incredible book, The Constitution of Knowledge. I hope we've done honor to the Steinberg family and to the wonderful grandmother that we heard about in the introduction. And so now we pass it back to Lewis or whoever it will be who will close us out for the night. Thank you so much, Jonathan. It's always a joy to speak with you. Your book is, I think, going to be seen as one of the 3 most important books of the decade. The other 2 have yet to be written, probably, but I'm putting my money on the Constitution
Well,
of
you're
Knowledge.
writing one of the others right now, and I can't tell you how much I enjoyed the conversation, but especially how much I enjoyed being with all of you tonight in a context that is so welcoming, and a culture that has been so vibrant and important.
Well, thank you both very much. What a great note to end the evening on. Overall, just an enjoyable and illuminating evening for everybody, and really some great advice for me as a father of a son about to go to high school. So very relevant and timely. Thank you all for participating via Zoom. Special thanks to Rabbi Shire and to Lewis, and of course a special thank to our wonderful speakers, John and John. Have a great evening, everybody. Thank you very much for participating.